Welcome to the Rider's Edge podcast, a platform to share conversations about the health and wellness of horse and rider. I'm your host, Farley Schweigert. Hey y'all, it's Farley with the Rider's Edge podcast. And today I have Nicole Coleman on the podcast, and we're going to talk about the top reasons why the pelvic core connection matters to rider performance in the arena. Welcome, Nicole. Thanks for coming back on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again. I'm so excited to come back and learn more about riding and also talk about and teach and explain more of how my knowledge is transferable to the rider and rider's edge and how it's all related when we really get down to it. So I'm excited.
Yay. Absolutely. It's, I think you now qualify as the guest that's come on the most on the Rider's Edge podcast so far. Yes.
Oh, I feel so special.
Yes. So we need to send you a Rider's Edge award for most appearing guests on the podcast.
I love it. Anything you send me, I would go gaga over.
We'll get summed up to you. But the reason why I have you on the podcast so much is because of your knowledge of the pelvic core connection and your experience in how everything that the pelvis is the foundation for our whole lives. And then it gets even more important as a foundation as a rider, that everything happens through there. And, how the core is not just your abs, it's everything that's going on down in your pelvis, everything all the way up to your diaphragm. And that whole connection happens into your legs, and then talking about into your shoulders and into your neck. So it all is interrelated.
Absolutely. And with riding, it's especially important because your pelvis is such a main connection point, and you don't interact with a robot. You interact with another living being creature. So there's a lot of communication that goes on through the pelvis that can impact your performance as well as your horse's performance and your overall well-being and health. So I love learning more about riding and talking about the pelvic core because of how important the pelvis is with riding and how all of that information translates on an even more important level for performance and taking care of your horse.
Absolutely. If we take the analogy of verbal and nonverbal communication, everybody's kind of used to that. And people who study horsemanship and work on that get as far into that as you and I talk about empaths.
That's our favorite thing right now. We have daily conversations about that. Oh.
And it's for me, it's all interrelated in my life. But if we're talking about if we try to quantify communication of the rider's body to the horse, there's a lot of more nonverbal communication that happens through the pelvis. Like if you had to classify verbal communication or direct communication, that would be your hands and your feet and your voice. But there's a lot of nonverbal communication that happens through your pelvis. You and I were talking before the show about nonverbal versus verbal communication and kind of how this analogy stacks up. And, like for me and my horses, I can stop them by just moving my pelvis. I can roll back onto my pockets and they know to stop within that movement, my shift in my body without ever touching the reins and doing different things. So I think really the first point I want to drive home for the listeners is, talking about the pelvis and, the mobility of it and how how to get, and give our listeners some actionable points on, as we talk about tight hip flexors and weak glutes, or just a mobility point, to really work on our communication through our pelvis, because mobility, we got to have mobility first and foremost, right?
Absolutely. And, for us as physical therapists, we think it's just enough to talk about, you need mobility, you need strength. And we think that people automatically are on board with us because we think other people think like us. And they don't, surprise. And what's even more fascinating in the riding world is now you have this new connection point, this new communication point with another living, breathing thing who's highly sensitive and in tune to your movements. And if you're unaware of your body and your movements, you're going to be providing input to that horse that you might not even realize. So you might end up confusing them. You might end up causing injury. You might end up causing undue strain to the horse as a result of not having A, awareness, and B, mobility, and C, adequate strength to tailor how you're communicating through your pelvis and the rest of your body to the horse. So that relationship is determined or affected by the pelvis even more so. And this is not really true in a lot of other sport and athletic activities, especially if you're interacting and communicating with a vehicle or a robot or a tool. It's not going to take all of that into perspective as much. And you have so many points of communication and ways to interact with the horse that you want to get all of them right so that you guys are in sync and, you can have that top level of performance and just even enjoyment. If you're not a performer or competitor, if you want to ride for enjoyment, that also is going to impact it, because then your horse is going to be more at ease. From what you've told me, pardon me, Farley, the horse will be more at ease and less likely to be injured, and it'll be more enjoyable for you both, because then when you're on that level of communication that you're aware of what's going on and you can alter it, that's going to lead to an even more desirable experience. So whether it's pleasure riding or competition, they're all going to be impacted. So that pelvis really is even more important in the riding arena. I made a little joke. My Midwestern, background, not getting much of that, but how important that is. And so that we speak the same language, so to speak. It just translates a little bit different in terms of maybe it's a slightly different accent. So I definitely love talking about the pelvic core because of how important the pelvis and everything around it is for the rider and the horse.
Absolutely. And mobility is the first thing that we've got to have. And, the thing with riding, as you talked about, is that everything we're talking about that we're kind of putting on a megaphone today in this conversation is very subtle things that you don't realize are happening, or you may realize they're happening, but they have to become second nature. So we're putting this on a megaphone of talking about the pelvic core, and the first step to getting an improvement in your riding, which will translate into a higher performance in the arena, is working on that mobility factor. Because if you can't move and groove, then, and just like you talked about, then your horse has to compensate for you, and your lack of mobility can cause health problems in your horse. And if we don't have a sound horse, we can't go to the rodeo. We can't go to the horse show.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be maybe your top tip for improving pelvic mobility?
So when it comes to pelvic mobility, we're talking about the pelvis, which also connects with the hips and the low back. And the easiest way to key in to the movements is to perform it either in lying on your back with your knees bent up, or in sitting, whatever is most comfortable for you and most accessible. And thinking about those pelvic bones, the two bones right in the front, that there's light beams shooting out from them. And if you're sitting, thinking about pointing those lights up toward the ceiling. And I love how you talked about rocking, rolling back onto your pocket. That is such a great way of summarizing that. Because I always struggle with the verbal communication to this. And that's a great way, especially for riders. So you roll back onto your pockets, and those lights coming out from your pelvis are going to point up toward the ceiling. So that's called a posterior pelvic tilt. And you'll feel that there's some tension in the back, the low back. So you're also bending or flexing in that lumbar spine, the lower spine. But that's a posterior pelvic tilt. And your weight gets pushed further back behind you, off of that pubic bone. Then you come back to center, and then you can think about moving the opposite way. So those headlights, if you're sitting, pointing down toward the floor and rolling off of your pocket. And you'll feel that it's a little tighter in the low back, and more of the pressure or weight is forward towards your pubic bone, in between, in the front, right in between your inner thighs. And that's called an anterior pelvic tilt. And that leads to extension in the lumbar spine, which just means that curve forward is enhanced. And you just learn to slowly rock back and forth in a pain-free range. And that's mobility in those two positions, anterior pelvic tilt and posterior pelvic tilt. And you can, if you're in sitting, you can feel how that would translate to what your horse is potentially feeling. If you're rocking back, rolling onto your pockets, the horse will feel your weight moving back. And if you rock your pelvis forward, you can feel the weight going more towards the front. That will impact your horse is hearing from your body through your pelvis. And then can I skip 2 spots ahead?
Yes.
Talk about posture.
Yeah.
How that impacts posture.
I do want, absolutely.
Okay. So I'll try to keep it quick so we can come back full circle. So when you go into that the posterior pelvic tilt, you notice that your shoulders might round more, your whole back is rounded, and your head might go forward. And if you go into that anterior pelvic tilt, rolling off your back pocket, you can see how it might be a little bit easier to open up your shoulders. Your spine is going to be a little straighter. And actually, you can go into too much of an anterior tilt, and your head is going to be more aligned. So posture is largely dictated in sitting by your pelvic position and how that impacts the rest of your spine and your shoulders and your hips and how you put weight through your feet. So you can feel the different postural positions. And ideal posture is kind of in the middle somewhere. And that's where we should learn to identify and control is in the middle first and foremost. So for you, what's in the middle of those two? Somewhere there's a little range of good posture. And I tell people that good posture is military posture minus 10%. So if you get a neutral pelvis, which is not where you're rolling back on your pockets or rolling onto your pubic bone, and your spine isn't bending forward or back too much, it should feel real natural. Your shoulders are down and back, and your neck is somewhat elongated, and your chin is almost tucked like you were going to hold a big apple between your chest and your chin. You want to have military posture minus 10%. So some people, their spine goes too straight, and that can cause problems too. And they've actually found that military posture, people who are in the military who engage in that posture can change the natural curve of the spine into a more unhealthy way, and that can cause problems as well. So you don't want to work against your spine, but kind of find that natural position that's most comfortable. It's also most stable. So the pelvis really drives posture, and that's kind of where I'll.
Yeah, well, and that's great, because really what you've described through there is, far as with riding, is going all the way from stopping your horse to going along with accelerating your horse, going from sitting back on your pockets into that posterior pelvic tilt to, if we're talking about a timed event, going forward and staying up with your horse so you don't get behind, because we all know as riders, if we get behind on our horses, we go to pulling on them, and that alters what's going on, and that eats up time. And so, if you're sitting there listening and you're like, okay, I know all this, Farley, the thing that Nicole and I are trying to get across today is that working on these basic things away from riding or before you ride as a pre-ride warm-up will continue to help your motor pattern and continue to help that become more automatic. Because if you're in a timed event or even a judged event, all these things, again, we're megaphoning them today, but they're very subtle things that just add up to a higher score or a faster time. And then additionally, your military posture minus 10% really kind of comes back to finding that neutral spine, finding that posture that works well for you when you're just riding at a steady pace, whether you're loping your horse around in a circle or trotting or whatever, or even walking, just kind of going through there. So to relate your three parts of getting good posture from the pelvis to riding, kind of really relates in that way.
Yeah, and when you're trying to work with acceleration or deceleration or turning, a lot of power is going to come from the pelvis and having it in the right position. That's going to drive how the rest of your body performs. So if you can get yourself to be aware of neutral, and then the posterior tilt rolling back on your pockets, and the anterior tilt, which is moving forward onto your pubic bone and off your pockets. If you have the awareness and the control, you're going to be able to drive forces and ability to turn and stop and start and accelerate with much more precision and less energy loss, so more efficiency. So instead of your feet or your legs having to make up for that, you're going to get that power that drives from the pelvis through the glutes and some of the other core muscles. That'll then let the other muscles do their job instead of having to take over. So you're going to get much better power control and efficiency when you have that pelvic control and mobility, and then strength comes down the line. And that also translates to your horse having to do less of the work, which leads to less likelihood of injury for the horse. So better performance and less injury and less strain to the horse.
Absolutely. So I think that was a good top point for our listeners on mobility. And I kind of want to build off of that into what something you just said, which was about the glutes. And, you know, I think it's a very big challenge in riding. It is in the American society, uh, even when we talk about non-riders, the glutes are a challenge. But
Mm-hmm.
I think
We're a flat
even
butt society.
we are, but I think it's even more of a challenge in riding, because we already have a flat butt society issue in that we're driving 8 hours, or we're sitting in the truck, or we work for a living to be able to afford our horse habit on the weekends. And then we go sit on a moving animal. So we never, get away from that versus, I've got a friend that not only does she ride, but she hikes and backpacks
Mm.
and stuff. So, she completely changes what she's doing in going into hiking and working things differently. But if riding's your primary thing, and no matter whether you do it for a living or you make a living to afford that, you're probably having trouble with those glutes and working through that. So talk to us a little bit, Nicole, about the glutes, and maybe give us one thing you can do to really start working on them to help build this foundation.
So there's two important muscle groups. There's actually three total types of gluteus muscles, but the third one isn't as important. It's not that it's not, but it's, if we try to teach you everything in one day, it's not gonna, we'll get blank stares like when my stepson is overwhelmed and he's a high school senior and it's like, what? You have to keep it simple, right? KISS
Yes.
principles. So the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius are the two major muscle groups that are important for pelvic health, spinal health, and what you and I have talked about, how important they are to riding. So the gluteus maximus is that larger muscle group, what we consider to mostly be the posterior or the posterior. I've heard it said both ways. And that largely drives the ability for you to come off the horse straight up. Okay, like you're going to push through your feet. It's the muscle group that works when you go from a sitting position to a standing position. You have other muscles that are working too, but in the gluteal region, the gluteus maximus works a lot to be able to move from sit to stand. So to push up. The gluteus medius is a little further off to the side, and that helps keep the pelvis in position from left to right. So when you're walking and you're on one leg as one other leg is in the air, the gluteus medius helps keep your pelvis level as you walk through. So they're both important in power and stability. And a great way to work the gluteus maximus muscle, there's actually one exercise I love that works both of them. But if you don't have any equipment, because my favorite exercise, you use a band around your legs. If you don't have any equipment, you can work on trying to get your glutes, your gluteus maximus engaged by doing a bridge. And a bridge is when you're on your back with your knees bent and your feet flat. You want to keep yourself in pelvic neutral, which we just talked about. Otherwise, you're just moving through the spine if you push up. So you want to keep your pelvis in neutral and push through your heels and lift your butt up a little bit. If you go too far, you're going to strain your spine. So you should feel the muscles working, right around that back pocket area, honestly. The gluteus medius is a little bit more difficult to work because most of us compensate with other muscle groups and never really strengthen that muscle. And we find other ways to move. And so for a lot of us, that is one of the weakest muscle groups in our body. And I think it's a big driver for a lot of other issues. But to work that gluteus medius muscle, you can stand with your feet slightly apart, holding on to like a countertop, and kicking one leg out to the side and seeing if you can feel something on the side of your hip. It'll be right above the bony point on the outside of your hip, but it's just above that. So it's a little more to the side. Excuse me. You shouldn't feel it in your back, and you shouldn't feel it towards the front, which is the TFL, the tensor fasciae lata working, or the hip flexors. So right out to the side. So you're working the leg you're standing on and the leg that's moving at the same time. Those are two really simple exercises to do. My favorite exercise that works both muscle groups at the same time is to do an exercise when you're lying on your back with your knees bent and your feet flat on the floor, and put a band just above your knees that is, you know, fairly tight, like a TheraBand or, you know, one of those circular bands.
Mm-hmm.
And you press your knees out against it to activate the gluteus medius, and then you do a bridge to activate the gluteus maximus. So that's, you know, more bang for your buck if you do it that way. So it all just depends on your circumstances and, you know, what equipment you have access to. But those are two really important muscles, the glutes, that are neglected for a lot of people, and yet also important in terms of how you can, just like we talked about how your pelvic mobility affects things like acceleration, deceleration, starting, stopping, and even turning, and how that will help your pelvis and the development of power to drive your movement.
I think that's great, because that, talking about glute strengthening today, we've talked about pelvic mobility, and then we talked about the glutes and why they are important. And it's a very easy doable way to get them engaged, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think getting all that down, those are nice actionable steps for people to do, because within riding, the glutes are important, like you said. You know, probably the easiest example of when glutes really work in your riding is when you're posting in a trot. So when you're rising up and down with the beat of the horse. But they still come into effect in our timed events or even our judged events, because you need that subtle movement and recruitment of the glutes to help with your pelvis movement, right?
Absolutely.
So one last place I want to touch on today for our listeners, and I know we'll have other conversations in the future. We always have good conversations.
Yes.
and to bring it in, and I really like the setup of what how we're talking about this today, giving one thing to work on and an actionable step about that thing and why it's important. But I want to talk briefly, and because this could be like 8 episodes onto itself, about the pelvic relationship with our breath. And people really don't always put 2 and 2 together, because your breathing happens in your lungs, doesn't it? Your lungs are not in your pelvis. I mean, I know a little bit about anatomy, Farrells. So talk a little bit about that pelvic breathing conversation, and give us one actionable thing we can do to work on our breath.
Awesome. And you're going to have to help me take this from big techie medical words down to real person words, because this is where I get really geeked up. So within the abdomen, within the trunk, you've got different cavities. That word always sounds weird to me, but that's what they're called. They're cavities. And you've got the pelvic cavity, which is where the pelvic organs are. You've got the abdominal cavity, which is where all of your digestive organs are, and your kidneys, your pancreas, your liver, your stomach. And then the diaphragm separates that from the cavity where your lungs are. So yeah, they're all separate. However, those are all also connected through the throat. So from the throat down to the pelvic outlet, which is right at the bottom of the pelvis, there's a pressurized system. So they're all connected together. And when you breathe in, your lungs get bigger and expand. And something has to become displaced somewhere. So typically, you'll have that pressure displaced down into the abdominal cavity. Well, then the abdominal cavity connects to the pelvic cavity, so that pressure differential keeps going. The cool thing about the pelvic cavity is that it's got a negative pressure system, which means it literally has a suction to keep things inside your body, despite the fact that if you're a male with, you've got 2 holes down there. If you're a female, you've got 3 holes down there. So despite the fact that there are openings, that negative pressure system is a big part of how our organs stay inside our body and don't fall out. And what a lot of people wouldn't know or realize is how your breath impacts those pressure systems. Most of us breathe in our upper chest and really don't expand into our true lung capacity by taking nice deep breaths. This is mostly due in part to a lot of us are stressed a lot of the time. And that fight or flight response that triggers from our brain into our body tells us to take shorter breaths so that we can get up and run if we need to. Just like they adapted this from, how many thousands of years ago. If danger is a tiger, we need to run away from a tiger. Well, it's now most of us aren't in danger of being threatened by a tiger, but our everyday stresses have become that tiger, and our body still responds in the same way. And so we tend to use neck muscles and upper chest muscles to breathe. A great way that all of us ideally should be practicing to breathe on a daily basis, at least once, is called diaphragmatic breathing. The diaphragm is what separates the lung cavity from the abdominal cavity, the lungs and the heart from the abdomen. And it's a big muscle that cuts straight through. And when you breathe deeply with your diaphragm, you're going to breathe all the way into the depths of your lungs, and you're going to use those pressure systems to your advantage to get more oxygen into your body, which will get more oxygen into your blood, which will get more oxygen to your muscles, which will lead to better performance. It also helps our brains. The more oxygen we get to our brains, the better they function. The diaphragmatic breathing is really thinking about letting our abdomen expand as we inhale. And I always tell people what we think of as deep breathing is the opposite of what I think of with like the Superman breath. I always think of like cartoons growing up, and Superman would take a big breath and his abdomen and waist would shrink and his chest would puff up. That's actually the opposite of the deep diaphragmatic breath. You want to think about your abdomen expanding and letting your shoulders relax, and then imagining from front to back and side to side, things are expanding down by your waistline. And what that does is that allows you to draw in more oxygen into the lungs. It also stimulates more of a relaxation. Now, posture plays a big role in just being able to do that. Because if you're in a posterior pelvic tilt, or an anterior pelvic tilt, you're kinetically, biomechanically set up that those lungs and diaphragm become more restricted. And you can't take as much of a deep breath as if you're in a good postural position, that pelvic neutral, not rolling back onto the back pockets, not rolling forward onto the pubic bone, somewhere in between, shoulders down and back, that military posture minus 10%. You feel, like you have presence when you have good posture, but you're not posing. It just feels natural. So when you're in that good postural position with that pelvic neutral, then you'll be able to breathe deeper, get more oxygen into the system, and get better performance both for your brain and your muscles. So posture and breath are really impacted, because if you're rolling back on those back pockets and you're bending forward, your diaphragm and your lungs are really restricted. You can't take a very deep breath. And the same is true for the alternative. So again, it comes back to finding that pelvic neutral for mobility and then control, and being able to practice that with good breathing habits, which will impact getting oxygen into the lungs. And you've also told me this, that the horse is very aware of our emotional state. So if we can get into better diaphragmatic breathing habits, that helps our system relax that fight or flight response into just a more neutral state, which communicates in all these different and some unknown ways to the horse that I'm relaxed. And that will help the horse relax and perform better, because just like when we're a little more relaxed, we perform better. The same is true for the horse. So it all kind of ties into posture, position, deep breathing, and then control, and then performance. So that kind of takes you full circle there.
See, you went full circle without me taking you from science to street speak.
I'm learning from you, finally.
When I was growing up, and my dad would help me at a rodeo getting down the alley with my horse, and he would always tell me to exhale at the beginning of the alley, or tell me to exhale right before I backed in the box. Because if you exhale, then you got to inhale and keep breathing, right? So for people who have pre-performance jitters or things, working on having just proper breathing, then have some kind of mental cue of, okay, breathe out and then go do whatever can help with that. So again, we're taking subtle things that add up to a big difference in your performance in the arena.
Yeah, and I totally forgot about the exhalation part, because to me it's automatic, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily true. It's also important to work on the exhalation, because you can get something called excess carbon dioxide. If you breathe in, but then don't breathe out all the way, you get a buildup of carbon dioxide. And it's not toxic. It's just that too much of it, and imbalance of it, leads to, not getting that oxygen where we want it. And so it is really important to exhale fully and practice the full inhalation and the full exhalation through the pursed lips. Like, breathe in through the nose if you can, like you're smelling the flowers, and then blowing out through pursed lips like you're blowing out candles. That really helps your system the best with oxygenization. Did I say that right? Oxygenation. And posture and getting all of the right functions going on. So yes, exhalation is very important. And I know one of the things they teach marksmen is to exhale right before you shoot. So it helps with stability, it helps with focus, all of those things. So yes, thank you for also bringing the exhalation part into it, because it's a cycle.
Oh, it's a huge cycle. So I feel like we've talked about 3 different things today and given an actionable step with each of them. And so if you're out there listening and this is really resonating with you and you want to take your current situation, your performance to another level, then reach out to me at writersedgetherapy.com. Nicole and I work together on a lot of different cases.
Yep.
And we'll be doing more so in the future.
Yes.
So we've got some things coming down the pipe for 2021 as we're finishing some things. And so and we'll have more conversations about this on the podcast to continue to just bring some actionable steps and some short bursts of information about the pelvic core connection and why it matters to rider performance in the arena.
Absolutely.
So, Nicole, thank you for having a conversation with me today.
You.
Always fun.
I love it all the time. It's my geek out session.
Well, I'll definitely have you on again and we'll have more conversations and continue to help riders work through their pelvic core connection.
Thank you.
All right. If you like I said, if you want to work with Nicole or I, reach out to writersedgetherapy.com and we can get you through the process to do that. And as always, I will see you down the road. Thank you for listening to Rider's Edge Podcast. For show notes and other thoughts, head over to writersedgetherapy.com. If you would like to stay connected and continue the conversation, head over to my free Facebook group, Rider's Edge Health and Wellness for Horse and Rider. Thanks for continuing the conversation, and as always, I will see